Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's panel event, What is Environmental Justice? My name is Ovita Williams, and I'm the Executive Director of the Action Lab for Social Justice. As we start tonight, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Lenape, the Manhattan, the Canarsie, the Shinnecock, the Regawank, Munsee, and Haudenosaunee Nation, on which I'm learning, working, and organizing today. We pay respect to all their ancestors past, present, and future. The land acknowledgement allows us to bring to the forefront of our minds and all we do a recognition that our lived experiences, our stories, our ways of being, the ways in which today we live, work, and create family is on the legacy of settler colonialism. By acknowledging Indigenous nations, we show respect and take meaningful steps in correcting and salvaging the stories and practices that were erased by settler colonialists. We also acknowledge numerous enslaved Africans and their families, their descendants whose forced labor contributed to the wealth of many educational institutions in this nation. We honor their sacrifice and recognize their violent journey, and we recognize their resiliency, strength, and beauty. We also recognize that the nation was built on their backs, a sacrifice that to this day has been discounted. We sit with First Nations people, honoring and recognizing history and culture, and honoring the truth of this country and the truth of many lands. We invite you to take a moment to consider the lives, culture, and legacy of Indigenous people, wherever you are right at this moment, as we aspire to honor the lives of so many and be in partnership. Thank you. I want to introduce you to the Environmental Justice Initiative, which is part of the Columbia University's Action Lab for Social Justice. The Environmental Justice Initiative started a year ago in the Action Lab with students who wanted to advocate and educate the community about environmental justice. I have to say that our initial conversations were focused on climate justice, and after several discussions, seeking more information, support from Drs. Cogburn and Dr. Winter, environmental justice, which encompasses racial justice, was where the initiative landed in terms of gaining a better understanding of the intersection between environmental justice and racism, and how environmental justice disproportionately impacts communities of color. Environmental justice shows up in different forms, whether it is through activism, entrepreneurship, education, and policies. The Action Lab's Environmental Justice Initiative seeks to spark robust conversations around environmental issues, racism, and inequity, and you'll hear from our panelists today, to underscore existing tangible solutions and create new ones that will ultimately lead to an equitable society. The purpose of this panel is to bring forth a discussion about the intersection of climate change, racial justice, the environment, and social justice, and further the conversation regarding environmental justice from a social work perspective. I really want to thank our panelists, Ariel Richter and Todd Reynolds. I'm so happy to see you all and have you here. And I want to send a special thanks and recognition to the environmental justice team. You'll hear from Rita Gonzalez and Sophia Schachner today, who will be the moderators, and I'll introduce them. Also, Allison Topaldo, Dr. Samantha Winter, Megan Ramchal, Dr. Courtney Cogburn, Michelle Peden, and Kalea Woods have all contributed to the work that the environmental justice team is doing in tonight's panel. Your moderators for tonight are Sophia Schachner and Rita Gonzalez, and I'll introduce them both, and then they will lead us in a moderated discussion, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. Sophia is currently a second-year MSW student in the Advanced Clinical Practice track, specializing in families, youth, and children. Her field placement is at Henry Street Settlement in the school-based mental health clinic at PS 134. Within the Action Lab, she's involved in the environmental justice and research and writing initiatives. She aspires to get her clinical license and work with children in the future. True to her Venezuelan roots, Sophia is a self-described coffee fiend and loves to dance to all kinds of Latin music. Hey, Sophia. Rita Gonzalez is a second-year master's student pursuing her MSW at Columbia University School of Social Work. She's a Harlem native and graduate of Barnard College, where she earned a degree in American Studies with a focus on race and ethnicity. Rita has a specific interest in criminal justice and the intersection between social work and the law, and is currently placed at the Columbia Justice Lab as a research and policy intern for Emerging Adult Justice Project. She hopes to work with justice-involved or incarcerated young adults and carry out research that influences and develops policies to improve opportunities for these young people. Rita is particularly passionate about creating an equal education system that is beneficial and fruitful for all young people, especially those who are incarcerated. Within the Action Lab's Environmental Justice Initiative, she's interested in how environmental justice and racial justice are intertwined, specifically when it comes to social determinants of health. I want to thank Rita and Sophia for moderating this panel tonight. And again, our panelists, Ariel and Todd, thank you so much. And I really look forward to hear what you all will share with us tonight. Thank you. Rita, Sophia, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. O, for the introduction and the land acknowledgement. So at this time, I'm really excited to introduce our first panelist for tonight, Mr. Todd Reynolds. So Todd is the executive director of Groundwork New Orleans. He has over 30 years of extensive experience in education, youth development and advocacy, project management, and design, building, construction. Todd has spent the majority of his career advocating for young people. He has a rock-solid commitment to educating and empowering youth from underserved communities throughout the country. Todd has worked within the New Orleans community for the past 13 years. As principal of Net Charter High School, he played a major role in the expansion of the school's network by helping guide the organization's development and implementation of 3 satellite schools, specifically designed to work with at-risk and out-of-school youth in multiple locations of New Orleans. As the executive director of Groundwork New Orleans, through a mixture of community-based foundation and public and private relationships, he has greatly expanded the Trust's operating budget, programs, capacity, and public presence. Todd holds a Master's of Science degree in Community Economic Development from the University of Southern New Hampshire and is certified to install and teach National Green Infrastructure Programming, Center for Watershed Protection GI Certificate Program, and he's also certified in quality control for government contractors throughout the United States Army Corps of Engineers. So welcome, Todd. We're so excited to learn from you today. And I will now turn it over to Sophia, who will introduce us to our second panelist.
Thank you so much, Rita, and thank you so much, Dr. O, for that wonderful introduction and land acknowledgement. So Ariel is a co-founder and chief executive officer at Urban Indigenous Collective. She is Afro-Indigenous and white. She's a descendant of the Carib Indians, the indigenous people of Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela. Ariel is a doctoral candidate at Columbia University School of Social Work, working within the Social Intervention Group under the direction of Professor Louisa Gilbert. Her focus is on intimate partner violence and access to relevant services for Black and Indigenous women who experience structural stigma related to drug use, involvement in the criminal legal system, sexuality, and race. Her work is grounded in principles of community-based participatory research as she works collaboratively with Black and Indigenous communities. Previously, she worked as an impact evaluator at the Administration for Native Americans, where she worked directly with community-based organizations, assisting them with determining what evaluation and success means for them. She is fiercely committed to addressing gender-based issues at large, especially gender-based violence, and has over 10 years of experience within domestic violence organizations, sexual assault resource centers, and economic enhancement programs for survivors of trafficking and domestic violence. She earned her Master's of Science in Social Work, Social Enterprise Administration from Columbia University School of Social Work in 2015, and is a licensed Master's in Social Work. So thank you so much, Ariel, for being here. And I will turn it over to Rita, and we'll begin with our questions for the panel.
Thanks so much. So as Dr. O mentioned a little bit about the topic of the panel, today we're going to be discussing environmental justice and its many facets. So I just kind of want to give you guys a brief structural overview of how the panel is going to look today. So we're going to begin with more broad and general questions, definitions, and then also have the panelists talk a little bit about their specific work. Then we'll go and dive more deeply into environmental racism. And then finally, we'll discuss the field of social work and how that relates to environmental justice and what we can do as social workers to advocate for those most impacted by environmental racism and environmental justice related inequality. So let's jump into our first question, which is, how would you define environmental justice, and how does environmental justice intersect with the work you do?
My definition of environmental justice is basically anything that combats what I call environmental injustice. And there have been myriads of examples of environmental injustice to Indigenous people, to BIPOC communities in most major cities around the country and around the world. Specifically here in New Orleans, we deal with environmental injustice issues from the effects of redlining and how those effects have moved through the years and still continue, and the environmental, social, and health impacts that has had to communities throughout the country. Where it connects with groundwork and the work that we do, that is our focus. We do environmental justice work in all communities in New Orleans, but specifically BIPOC and communities that have been traditionally marginalized and left out of basic infrastructural needs here in New Orleans, from adequate draining to adequate tree canopy to heat island effect to negative health outcomes. So our program is based through multiple kind of avenues. One of the largest avenues is the community-based green infrastructure projects that we do, where we work with local nonprofits, local communities in the communities, and designing green infrastructure solutions that will alleviate some of these environmental ills and the negative outcomes that have been occurring for centuries here in New Orleans.
Thank you, Todd. I also want to point out this is my first time meeting Todd. So when my face reacts, it's because I'm learning some of these new things and the work that you're doing. So I'm really excited to be here today. I thought a lot about this question as I was, preparing for today, and there are plenty of definitions online about what environmental justice can be. The EPA has their own definition of what environmental justice is. And I really liked how you brought up, Todd, that it is just, not just, but it is combating things that are environmentally like injustices. So I have a very short definition that probably will change every time you ask me what it means. But I think about, both equity and equality in the ways in which we as people relate to the land that we are currently living in, and relate and show up and experience like our lives in relations to others. So like a big part of what you'll hear from me today is about kinship and how we relate to other communities, and then also to our living but non-human things in the world. So like animals and plants and the land and water and those type of elements around us. And the way it intersects with the work that I do, I'll get into this a little bit more, but I do a lot of work around, like I mentioned, gender-based violence, and I can explain this a little bit later about, you know, this very real connection between missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirit folks, and the various extensions of settler colonialism that we see through like larger projects, whether it's like pipelines, mining, everything having to do with water. And I can focus on that a little bit later and kind of break down how those connections are. But that's how you may hear my background. I'm like, oh, a lot of years in domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And this is kind of why I'm here today.
Great, thank you. Those were both really interesting definitions of environmental justice, and they were similar but different, which I really appreciate. So the next question is, what is the relationship that you guys see between environmental justice and climate change? And then also, how is environmental justice a human rights issue? I know those are two kind of different questions, but yeah, what are your thoughts?
So environmental justice and, I'm sorry, repeat the first.
The
question for me.
relationship between environmental justice and climate change.
I mean, for me, they go hand in hand, because the neighborhoods and the communities that I spoke of before are directly affected by climate change, whether it be oppressive heat due to the heat island effect for here in New Orleans, whether it be the rising river, the rising Gulf, the rising ocean, and then our hurricane season. All of these climate issues, you know, directly impact the lives of folks here in New Orleans. I was born and raised in the Northeast, but I've been down in New Orleans for 15, 20 years or so. And I can't underscore the impact of environmental change just on my daily life, and how that, you know, with the communities that I work on, to see what happens when we get a hurricane warning, when we get a hurricane in the Gulf, when our heat index is 117 at 9 o'clock in the morning. All of those, you know, oppressive, stifling, health hazard heat for 6 to 7 months out of the year. And it keeps getting worse and worse and worse through climate change. So there is a definite one-to-one correlation between environmental justice and climate change, specifically where we're hardest hit here in the South. Second part of the question?
The second part is, how is environmental justice a human rights issue?
Oh, I mean, can I share my screen for a second?
Yeah, of course.
I can just show you just an example of a project of how it is a human rights issue. Can everybody see this map on my screen? So what this is through an EPA grant, my organization is doing a trash-free waters initiative, and from Mobile, Alabama, all the way to Dallas, each of us working in our own waterways, pulling out trash and debris from our waterways. To date, we've pulled out 78,000 pounds of trash from Dallas to Mobile to New Orleans. We decided here, since we didn't really work with the Mississippi River, that we were going to work with our catch basin system. We have 68,000 catch basins in New Orleans that catch stormwater and move it directly to Lake Pontchartrain and then out to the Gulf. So anytime trash goes into the system, it pollutes the system. So we're combating that. But as it relates to human rights, what we have found out is that if you notice on the screen, all of the blue dots are catch basins that have been maintained. which are normally in neighborhoods of affluence. All the ones that are, if you ever get a chance, I'll send you the link, that are Black are the ones that, oddly enough, they're Black and they have not been maintained. But even more egregious is what we call these yellow blocks here. They're what we call drainage dead zones. Now, can you imagine living in New Orleans, several feet under sea level? There is no drainage infrastructure in this 4-block stretch. So these folks are relegated to living in horrendous conditions. When it rains, the water doesn't go anywhere. It stagnates. It creates a health hazard. It creates mosquitoes. And it is definitely environmental justice and human rights issue that people are forced to live this way in this time. So these are some of the things that we're combating. By we're going to go in and we're going to reforestate this whole community. We're going to create, we're going to put like 34 to 40 full-grown trees. We're going to create water catchment. We're going to solve this environmental justice issue and human rights issue, because people do not deserve to live. And these are tax-paying, going to work, productive citizens, and they're being forced to live this way. So this is one of the challenges, specifically about environmental justice and human rights.
Thank you for sharing that work with us, Todd. I am thinking more about this latter half of the question about as like a human rights issue. Just as Todd said, like environmental justice and climate change, there's like, when I thought about it, I was like, I can't think of how these things can be extricated or separate or different things. Maybe I should have worked harder to think of them as different, but I am thinking about how, conservation, kinship, and relationship to land and like other living things is often embedded into our way of life as, I guess, Indigenous and Indigenous descendants. A lot of my responses today will be coming from just one person's Indigenous perspective, but that's kind of this perspective that I speak from a lot. And I was thinking about how, at least globally, Indigenous people make up, so it's like somewhere around like 5% of the population, but account for conserving like at least 30% of the land and the life in those areas. And I'm thinking about, like my early days working tangentially on like the Dakota Access Pipeline, like the No DAPL that was coming from the Bakken oil fields in North Dakota. I helped plan the welcome run that the youth ran from Cannonball, North Dakota to Washington, D.C. It was my years living there. And ironically, my apartment was literally on the front side of the Army Corps of Engineers. It was on the front side of their office. So they were in the apartment right, or the building right behind me. So that was kind of like my foray into environmental justice. I think I wrote one paper for the contemporary social issues class, that like if you're a CSSW student, that class. That was my first time really learning about that, and then moving to DC and then thinking, oh, I have no clue, like I have no desire to want to run or plan a run. My friend said, hey, do you want to help me plan this run? I'm like, absolutely not. But then she explained what was happening and who we would be welcoming and the purpose of this. It kind of kicked off that activism. I hate using the word activist because it feels like, again, when I talk about this relationship to land and kinship and conservation, activist sounds like you can step in and out of that role. And it's like, oh, this is a cute, fun thing I'll do. You can post pictures, you can do these things, which I think are important. And I know we'll talk a little bit about later. But for so many of our communities, like I'm just going to use BIPOC for this, that it is core to like us living and surviving. And it is in direct, I guess, against capitalism, like the theft and concentration of land among people with wealth has been central to the exploitation, dispossession, and just systemic disregard of Indigenous and Black lives and other vulnerable populations, that is how, you know, it ties into being like a human rights issue, that everything is so exasperated in like our communities. Like, we don't have a second home to go to or a place to flee to. It is very real. You know, I think about New Orleans and how people are like, oh, why don't people just move from such a dangerous area? It's not easy to just move. That requires wealth and capital and all these other things that we may not have access to. So sorry, that was a little bit long, but it brought up so many things as I started talking. So I'll stick to the script or stick to the questions.
Yeah, no, I mean, you both kind of touched on this already in your answers, because we know that there's like a relationship between how the environment can affect certain people and also someone's like socioeconomic class, someone's neighborhood, and that's also really intertwined with race. And so this is kind of where I was interested, just also growing up in New York City, seeing how like the city and the environment of the city impacts people and their health. And yeah, like extreme temperatures, access to food, that kind of stuff. So this question, I'm so interested in hearing your responses to. But what is environmental racism? I know it's like a huge question, but how do you guys see, either on the ground or, you know, more broadly, to how racial justice and environmental justice intersect? And yeah, I mean, you guys have spoken about how we can see how this is like, it can impact people's daily lives, and also, like I mentioned, people's health. But yeah, so what are your thoughts on that?
So I can give an example that we struggle with here in New Orleans. So, you know, we've all seen redlining maps and how the exact spot that was redlined and exact communities become the devalued properties, and then don't get the infrastructure and then decline. Where I think where these two connect, we're struggling with it here, is that we work in the majority underserved communities, going in and installing green infrastructure so people can just walk out the front door when it rains, or walk across the street when it rains, or get to their car when it rains. And we've been doing them. Groundwork's been around since 2006. I took over about 3 years ago, and you know, what we're finding, especially when you talk about kind of racial injustice, there's things going on where we will go into, we'll work with the community. We're always community driven. You know, we don't come in and say, hey, let's make your life better. Let us do this thing for you. Instead of let's sit down, let's hear them. We love to talk to what we call community historians, people who have lived in that community for centuries and centuries and centuries, families, and they can tell you this. You can go in with all the maps and all the, hey, we want to do this. But when you speak with them, it's like, this is what happened. This is the story of this community. So, you know, we go in and we design green infrastructure to, like I said, help, you know, just help the environment, help their environment, just help them create a better life, quality of life. Unfortunately, and this is probably in other areas, 80% of African Americans in New Orleans are renters. So they're living in rental properties and have been living in these properties for generations. We have going on here now something that we call greenification. It's not gentrification, it's greenification, where we go in and we put the green infrastructure in and we help the current residents. Well, lo and behold, the homeowner decides that my property is some more value now. So we're going to have to displace you. And we have a very increasingly large homeless population here, a working homeless population here in New Orleans. So we're looking to combat that as we work with communities and digging in more to find out, who are the homeowners? Is the actual resident the homeowner? And not by byproduct of improvement are we displacing folks? So that's something that we combat here a lot, and it really, and you add on top of that, and what I wanted to say before is we are still, I'm sure in other areas of the country, we are still dealing with racist policy and environmentally unfriendly policy, where like even in New Orleans, we'll have a street that cuts across the cross section of the entire city from lake to the river. And during the construction, there'll be reforestation, there'll be trees and palm trees and all kinds of trees and greens and foliage. Till you get to a certain street, then you get concrete and more concrete and environmentally friendly building just because of the nature and who is living in that neighborhood. And it's literally split by one street where a 5-mile stretch will have palm trees and bushes in the median. And as soon as you go into the BIPOC neighborhood, they get concrete and they don't get any. So we're still dealing with racist building policy, racist code policy. So that's still a continual, and all the while knowing that when you put that concrete in there, you're increasing the heat of that neighborhood exponentially. You're increasing the heat island. You're decreasing positive health impacts. So we're still dealing with that on a daily basis also.
Most of my answers are going to be one of two things: capitalism or settler colonialism, because it's very enduring. So I had mentioned a little bit in my prior answer about exploitation and dispossession of land, and that these things have been systemic. That's exactly why we're seeing people of color being disproportionately impacted right now. It doesn't just stop. It's because you can't just move around, and the policies have actively not been changed, and things have been kind of going the opposite way. I'm thinking about, this is where I'm going to kind of draw that connection between these disproportionate impacts of like how at least Indigenous people, some Indigenous people have been affected through projects such as pipelines and fracking and even mining. With those projects come the creation of man camps, which are construction crews of mainly men, who are now being concentrated into these areas that are predominantly Indigenous or Native folks living there. And there's been a marked increase in violent crimes, even in predominantly non-Indigenous communities, but because extractive industries disproportionately target Indigenous communities, Indigenous people, specifically women, are at a higher risk of being affected by these things. So we're seeing not only the threat of pipelines and water being ruined, because you can't unruin that water, that is going to be affecting everybody. Then you're also seeing violence coming. So it's this like extraction of land and extraction of people, which is just like extremely heartbreaking. But that's kind of like one of the very concrete ways that we see the disproportionate impact of people of color, specifically Indigenous folks. There's something like there's over 2,000 pipelines. So what is it, some odd 2,000 pipelines across 305 1,000 miles of interstate and interstate pipelines in the US. And so many of those are coming through Indigenous communities. And it's not as if, oh, that's the most direct way. When we see, we can go back to the Dakota Access Pipeline. It was supposed to be in another area, but that was predominantly white. They fought, so NIMBYism, not in my backyard. And then it got moved to across treaty area of the tribe there. So it's not like it's, oh, this is the best for all, or just it's so happenstance. It is very like a concerted effort. It is meant to move to the most vulnerable areas, because if you are fighting for other things in your life, it is harder to focus on this longer term project that is coming. So that is kind of what I had prepared for that part of the question.
I'd like to piggyback on what Ariel, it's a different context, but it is a similar theme. And I get in trouble for saying this all the time, but I don't really care. So what I've noticed here is that this city, and probably other cities, as I always like to say, the structures here are designed to create a permanent working class. They are not designed to promote higher education. Higher education is promoted to the few and far between. It is designed to promote the Walmart worker, the restaurant worker, the hotel, people to feed the machine, and even goes into housing policy that's designed to break up families of color. And there's also a huge system of pacification going on here. And I think with the public housing policy, and bringing people into a mode of, I can live a certain way without trying to be upwardly mobile. I will be comfortable, but I will not advance. And if I do advance, my circumstances, the expense of my circumstances increases exponentially. So it's designed for folks to stay exactly where they are. Unfortunately, when you tie it into environmental justice, the places that they're staying exactly where they are the ones that are hardest hit by environmental issues, poor health issues, crime issues, as you spoke of before, Ariel, because there's just this sense of hopelessness and apathy sometimes, in some cases, and you mix all that up into this bowl, and we have what we have, and it's a daily struggle, but we're committed to keep fighting the fight.
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys have touched on this a little bit, but obviously policy is very important in what goes on and how it can be remedied. So I think a question, I mean, obviously, like, people dedicate their lives to, pushing against old policy and writing new policy, but I would wonder, is there anything that we can do, like, community wise, to help push back against policies that are environmentally racist? Is it a more local thing? Is it something that we can look at, like, on the national scale? Just like any advice that you guys have.
Very briefly, I'm sorry, I didn't know I couldn't do that. And that's what we have to do. We have to do what we know is correct. If you tell me I can't plant a tree somewhere because of some arcane policy, I'm going to put a tree there. Now, if you want to fight me on that tree, that's kind of silly, that you would fight me on that. And I'd love to have the news cameras come up and watch you take that tree up in the neighborhood that is suffering from heat island effect. So I think we just have to, we have to be, as Ariel said, not so much activist, a little radical sometimes, in doing what needs to be done because we know it's right. And what we found is that they usually give up, and then in some areas they'll give up and tweak the policy. because it doesn't make any sense anymore and it's archaic. But I think, we as practitioners who do this work have to continuously push the envelope in multiple ways. I jest about, oops, I'm sorry, but we do a little bit of that, but we're in your face, and we're at City Hall and we're at City Council, and we're not coming alone. So it's just, it's a continued battle, but you 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and we're getting there.
Yeah, absolutely radical. I'm not gonna, it's so funny. A couple years ago, I probably would have been more careful in how I framed what I'm going to say. But, through my work with around the Dakota Access Pipeline, again, I come back to that a lot because that was really the first time I was really, really mobilized into this being my life, and something that was before work and after work and in between work and consumed a lot of my time. Like, we're going to be radical, and okay, the first part of your question, this is multi-level work. It's rooted in the community, and especially within Indigenous communities, we are sovereign nations. Like, it's not just like, oh, we should respect, but like literally we are sovereign nations. Like, consultation isn't like a suggestion, it is a requirement, at least with the over 600 federally recognized tribes, and that's a whole thing of whether you have recognition or not. But so, like, again, rooting in community, knowing that I love the word, the title that Todd said, community historians. Like, we would consider that like our elders, because we've known what to do the whole time. I mean, I have a friend who works in environmental justice around like fire policy and resilience. She did her dissertation work at Stanford in California, so she's studying wildfires in California, and lo and behold, after big studies, it was like, oh, Indigenous practices of keeping forests safe was the way to go the whole time. Like, we're not surprised by that. And then also, so like, one, again, being rooted in community, trusting. Unfortunately, we live in a capitalist society, so like that money, like we need to put money towards like these types of fights. And then again, like sometimes you got to do things that aren't, legal right now, because there was a time when, segregation was on the books. So like, yeah, we were doing something against that. So technically it was illegal, but was it correct? Was it ethical? Was it moral? What the law said? No. And then also, again, thinking about Dakota Access Pipeline, like there were, FBI, there were undercover people who made relationships with organizers and activists who were at the encampment to specifically target them, follow them longitudinally. They started relationships with them so that they could imprison them, so that they could not actually fight back, so that the government could bring charges against them. So like, it's a stacked battle. We're not fighting fair. We're not fighting. So, that was one of the largest occupations we've seen, of the land around where the pipeline was supposed to be. It started with just a couple of tents, and then that grew through, it was like April 2016 through December, when they had to evict the camp at Dakota Access Pipeline because of just people were unprepared for a Midwestern winter. But like, again, those were not legal ways of doing things. But, I think there was just an article yesterday saying that, it's been a long-standing fight. So this is why it's got to be multi-level. You got to be on the ground. You got to be at council meetings. You have to be occupying. You have to be training yourself to stuff. You have to stop action. But it's like from every single kind of like every way that you can do it, because it's not just one way that it's going to happen. And it's going to be a lot of like across communities is really important, because there's more of us. But we just have to be able to come together. And that sounds really Pollyanna-ish, like just come together. But we are all disproportionately experiencing these things, but are coming up against people who are not fighting fair. So, we have to come up with creative and radical ways of addressing these issues. You're really, really fired up about that one.
No, thank you so much. I mean, those were great responses. I wish we had more time to keep talking about it, but I have to turn it over to Sophia, who's going to take you guys through the next few questions. So thank you so much.
So we've been hearing a lot about different policies that are unjust, environmentally unjust. You talked a lot about, redlining and some of the impacts that has had on communities. There's so many examples of environmentally unjust policies in this country, and we've been talking about Indigenous communities and the Dakota Access Pipeline that has had a gigantic impact. And so, this greentrification that you had talked about, Todd, that was a new term for me, definitely, and has definitely gives us a lot to think about. So the next question, and you've already kind of touched on this a little bit or a lot, how can social workers promote environmental justice in their practice from the micro to the macro level? So we've been talking about where the environmental justice work operates. And like you were saying, Ariel, it's kind of multi-level. But so can you elaborate a little bit more on that and what social workers can do?
Yeah, I mean, I have these conversations almost every day. I'm thinking about micro level and how, these disproportionate effects are, over large swaths of people, like whole communities. And I think a big part around the work I do is also, helping people find therapists who align with them racially, ethnically, and kind of just fundamentally. And a big part is, I think, for social workers at the micro level, acknowledging that these are actual systems that you can't CBT or DBT your way out of these effects. And just part of being a good clinician is being yeah, that's really shitty. This is awful, these systems. So I'm just thinking on a very client, practitioner level, not trying to make excuses, but saying yes, capitalism does cause these things. Historical trauma is part of this, that these are things that you were experiencing because of this messed up world around us. I think that's really helpful. And then, so obviously I haven't been in the micro world in a while. I've been in program evaluation and the meso and macro world for a little bit, but I was just thinking about me personally and being in, someone who goes to therapy, you need to know and hear that there's validation that there are messed up systems that you can't individually get out of this. It's kind of this whole climate change. What is the word I'm looking for? I always come back to the plastic straws thing. we're not going to make up for these massive policies that involve oil and spills and these huge detrimental things that are huge lobbies of even big agriculture and farming that are messing up things for individuals, and then put the onus on individuals to ask for a paper straw and not a plastic straw. And I think that also kind of aligns with just how we work as supporting folks who are experiencing this on an individual level. And then another aspect is also educating yourself and make about these different issues. On a more macro and advocacy level, it would be remembering and actively pushing to have, Indigenous, I'm going to speak from an Indigenous perspective, having consultation as a key part of the work that you do, because I think there can be many well-meaning social workers. Again, I'm only going to speak of social workers because I'm not from another discipline, that as I was organizing, often Indigenous voices would be left out and we wouldn't have a real meaningful voice at the table, or the whatever table we were at. So I think that is also another really important aspect of what social workers can do in like community-based work and really reaching out to communities and then supporting those voices. I think the easiest, or not the easiest, but once we are invited to tables, sometimes we do need somebody else to say, hey, that person was talking, or we haven't finished hearing from that person. And in that type of support. So like not speaking over us, vulnerable populations and like BIPOC communities have always had a voice. It's sometimes and most often other times people needing to just shut up and be quiet. And I'm not very eloquent in how I say some of this, so I will make sure that I keep any curse words out, but that's just kind of part of being in it all the time.
For your curse words. No, but you're exactly right. As far as as social work, where I'm been a principal for years, been an educator for years. A lot of my, even as an executive director, a lot of my day-to-day work is social work because I work very closely with the young people in our program. I would suggest one. I think where, and even as a principal, we for school we all committed to govern ourselves through restorative approaches, and that was the way we ran the school. If you did not agree to use restorative approaches as an organization, basically just couldn't work for us. And that meant that when there was conflict between staff and staff, between staff and student, that we all went into the restorative process mode and put everybody through that process, which is like Ariel talked about, is you could either do, we would do restorative circles, we would do one-on-one restorative meetings, and it is a space that everyone is given the opportunity to say what they have to say. People do not interrupt, you set ground rules. So we found that to be very effective. I guess the biggest thing with the social work piece is one, developing a relationship with the clients. And there's always been, where is that line? And as a social worker, as a person who works in human services, you absorb a lot from your clients. You've got your day-to-day stuff going on with your own self, but your job is to support, and your career is to support others. And a lot of times you absorb a lot, whether it be positive energy, whether it be negative energy, and take that into consideration. But the best results that we found is when we develop real relationships with our clients. For me, it's the young people that are in my program, knowing what's really going on in their lives, getting to the point where you get a young person to come to you and say, hey, I need help, which is, you shattered a bunch of walls there. But that's only developed through trust and doing what you said you were going to do. And that's kind of one of the biggest things. The other thing, and Ariel kind of touched on this, is we already have these systems set up that they exist, they can be helpful. And I'm talking about resource systems. When a client needs X or Y, there's the traditional thing, okay, I'll send them over here to get some assistance here, I'll send them over here. I think we have to, as social workers and people who work with the populace, we have to start being more creative and coming up with alternatives that, because what you understand is people that you continue have already been through all this. They've already been through the stop here, the stop there, the stop there, to fill out this piece of paper here, to get this paper here, to get this thing. So they've done that already. So as you look at, maybe a new social work paradigm, is how do we coexist with those systems, because they do have some value, but they can't be the base of the pillar. They just can't. The base of the pillar has to be the relationship and trying to develop different ways to help your clients, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your responses. And you are both very eloquent in answering all of these questions, and we really appreciate your responses. So some of the things that y'all mentioned in answering this question, this last one was, how representation is so important at the table in supporting the voices that are the least heard, but also the most impacted, to have the onus of responsibility on corporations and governments and not just the individuals. As you said, with the example of the straws, of the plastic straws, Ariel, developing relationships and how that's kind of the basis and the kind of the strongest pillar for the foundation of our work. And all of those things are incredibly important. Restorative justice approaches and that using that as a lens, as the basis of our work, also incredibly important. So we only have a couple more minutes for our last question, and then we'll go on to the Q&A. So there are a couple of questions, but I'll just stick to one. So what specific environmental justice issues do you see locally? And in the Harlem area in Columbia or in New Orleans, for Todd, how can we take action to remedy them or bring awareness to them?
I mean, close your eyes and throw a rock in New Orleans and you'll hit an environmental justice issue. I mean, it's just kind of what we deal with. As the earth gets hotter, storms get stronger, and that's our hugest. I mean, what do we have? 22 named storms, 12 or 13 of them came into the Gulf. New Orleans took basically 2 direct hits in 1 year. The Gulf region in itself. There's climate change, and that's the macro of have we gone past the tipping point? And if so, what does that mean environmentally for folks all over the world, but specifically those really that are impacted in the Gulf region? There are some studies out there where New Orleans is not talking about environmental issues. They're talking about relocation, and that's how basically moving a city, because we may have reached the tipping point of no return because of where we sit between the Mississippi River, between Lake Pontchartrain. All of those are rising. They continue to rise. But in the meantime, over the next 30 so years, it's just environmentally trying to make this city livable, with whether it's street flooding, whether it's an inadequate pumping system, whether it's an oppressive heat island. New Orleans has the highest heat island effect in the country by about 15 degrees. So we are roasting, and it is getting worse. So kind of what we're looking at is 1, green infrastructure, 2, heavy dose of tree canopy, just to kind of alleviate some of these heat issues, some of these air quality issues here in New Orleans. So those are our biggest challenges, is staying above water on a street and local level, not the entire city flooding. It's what happens at Thursday, 3 o'clock in July every day, which is a 2-inch deluge of rain in some spot of the city, and several blocks go underwater. And then because there's no tree canopy, steam literally comes off the ground when the sun comes back out again. The humidity, I call it liquid air. We could have not a cloud in the sky. It'd be 90 degrees and 92% humidity. That's a thing here. So the air has in it, it's hard to breathe. So we've really got to work on the tree canopy. We've really got to work on, decreasing this heat island effect, and really work on our street flooding. And that's totally due to the environment and the amount of just storms that we have on a daily basis here.
There are two things that I want to highlight in New York City right now. One, similar to the increased temperatures, I think it was last summer they did a study where they drove around with the temperatures in Harlem and I think part of the Bronx, compared it to the Upper West Side, where there's a lot more trees and it's just this lovely place to walk around. And I think the temperature difference was 15 degrees. It was so much hotter. So when you ask about locally in Harlem, what's happening, I haven't really looked into addressing that, but I think, at least for the folks on this call today, think about how you can get involved at the, micro, meso, and macro levels, because there are many ways that you can. I'm sure there are definitely groups who are actively, trying to work against this, and it's always a support to have other communities and other groups cross support and amplify. The other thing that I'm thinking about is the North Brooklyn pipeline that, oh God, who is funding it? Who's building it? It doesn't matter who's building it, but it has been dubbed the North Brooklyn pipeline. There are many groups that I've been involved with who, or at least tangentially, who are actively working against fracking and the parts of Brooklyn that it wants to go through, or that they have it planned to go through. So if there are two things you're trying to think about, how can I get involved, or what are things that I should look up, you can literally just look up No North Brooklyn Pipeline, and there are several Twitter accounts and several community organizations and mutual aid organizations who are doing work on that. I'm just not as connected with that because my work brings me a little bit outside of New York City most of the time.
And Ariel, do you mind posting those in the chat for everyone to see? That'd be really great, those resources.
There's also there's several websites. One the Trust for Public Land does that is very interactive. So you can pick any part of the country, any city, and you can do overlays of trees, sidewalk, temperatures. It's pretty informative when you're looking at specific areas and trying to figure out what the environmental issues are in those areas. And you can tinker with it. We use it all the time. I don't have the website off the top of my head, but I can put it out in an email after, track it down.
Wonderful. So now, thank you so much for your responses to those questions. And I feel like as social workers, we're always looking for things of what can be done, what can we do? And those were some excellent ideas on what is needed to be done locally, and how we can individually get involved. So we have a couple of questions in our Q&A, and for participants in the audience, you can post your more questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we will answer them. This is now, we're going into the Q&A section. And so the first question, one of the first questions that we got was, do you think litigation can play a role in bringing about environmental justice? So this is a question from Lydia. For example, the families of the Sandy Hook victims recently reached a $73 million settlement with gun manufacturers. Could there be a similar path for those whose lives negatively impacted by environmental injustices?
Absolutely. There are actually a few going on right now. The EPA is actively in litigation with several large companies who have done environmental damage. Some are in settlement as we speak. So look for some large settlement news coming out from the EPA on industries that have done severe and corporations that have done severe damage to the environment. They'll be coming out soon, and they're going to be some big ones.
I'd like to add on, I think absolutely that's a venue that we can see change. And you know, this is a litigious country. Things take a long time. Again, it is one piece to things. And then I also think about when you have extreme wealth, if you can afford, like sometimes their game plan, like these large corporations, is to just pay fines. Like as long as that's an option to just pay fines, it doesn't, not that it doesn't matter, but like from their point, it doesn't matter what happens because they're like, oh, we'll just pay the fine or we'll do this and we'll keep literally building and moving forward. So yes, it is an option, and yes, it is a venue and can provide real tangible help to folks. I also want to acknowledge that like reparations and paying money to folks when you are not the elite is very, very tangible and helpful. But then again, you can't undo oil spills. You can't undo these things that are happening. So it makes me think about, you know, the other piece of the puzzle of like stopping things from happening in the first place. Because again, as long as paying fines is an option, they're going to keep moving forward and just like, oh, well, that's something we'll just kick down the road and fix later and hope that we can either bribe people off or, you know, just wait till they give up or unfortunately wait till they die, because the harms are so very real. I think about the oil in California and the exponential rates of cancer that happen to the folks living in there. It's mainly Black and Indigenous people. So not to be, you know, so sad about like, yes, this is a way to move forward, and that like all to say that each piece is really important and that we can't just rely on one thing to be like, this is the one thing that's going to stop everything. And you know, everything's fixed now. It's a very concerted effort from all angles to stop, because corporations are using many, many things in their toolbox that are just shinier and brighter and more well-resourced.
Totally agree, Ariel. The fine has to hurt. And if it doesn't hurt, it just becomes a part of doing business. So totally agree. Enforcement is a big issue, and making sure that those fines could cripple a corporation, not them flip off a few bills off the top and keep, like you said, keep on doing the same thing. So totally agree.
Yeah, there's another question that I was really drawn to in the Q&A, which is what texts, readings, or organizers do you recommend to us to further deepen our knowledge around environmental justice?
I'll let you handle that one.
I'm going to post something in the chat. Basically, I'm going to be referring you to another resource of someone who is definitely well more resourced than I am. Her name is Dr. Lydia Jennings. She is she's an Indigenous soil scientist. She calls herself, let's see, her website is nativesoilnerd.com, and I'm going to put it in the chat. And she has done a lot of work on mining, work in the Southwest, and how to, you know, bring back flora and fauna to those areas. But she does have a wonderful resources section on her website, resources and tools around supporting land justice, options for transferring land, and then consultation toolkits. So there's a lot of, and then she also had some readings under there as well. Obviously I fangirl a little bit over her. She's wonderful. She has like a 15-minute video, gosh, what year am I from? movie. I say video and recordings all the time. She is a runner and native and soil scientist, and kind of talks about this overlap of running with purpose and running as activism to bring awareness. There are a lot of people doing that type of work. So I am going to post that in here. She's also like a friend. And then there's another person you can look up. Oh, I am literally typing on the wrong keyboard.
She got this one.
Okay, so I'm just gonna post this, and then also, oh, how do I send? Okay. I think I typed that right. Yeah, Native Soil Nerd. Yeah, so she's got a lot of resources on there, and a great reading list that I was just looking at right before I signed on.
But I could add, there is coursework in National Green Infrastructure Certification, which people may be interested in, and you can Google green infrastructure, and that will give you a good idea of the kind of what green infrastructure is, how it's a nature-based solution to alleviate the pressure on our gray infrastructure. So it could be some interesting reading for folks also.
Now, I would also like to add Professor Samantha Winter. She also teaches the environmental justice course at Columbia, the School of Social Work. And I actually took her class last year, and it was really what got me interested in this subject as well. So another question in the chat, in the Q&A, it says, our society wants us to believe that our food system isn't crumbling, but with many people needing food assistance, accessibility to healthy food options, food waste, etc., how can we organize around this? And I would add food insecurity as well. Yeah.
Well, see here, I mean, we can just tell them we have, here in New Orleans, we have multiple food deserts in multiple communities, food quality, especially in BIPOC communities, and the young people, firsthand knowledge of the young people that we work with, and seeing what their menu looks like on a daily basis is totally healthy. There are several initiatives that are going on here in the city. We have community garden initiatives. We have edible garden initiatives through a few of our high schools here. A lot of the initiatives are based in taking up properties around the city, not so much brownfield properties, but just properties that can be restored and revamped and turned into growing media. So there are multitudes of small community-based nonprofit organizations here in New Orleans that specifically do food insecurity, grow food, supply food for free, do food education. So there's multiple ways that is being addressed here on the local community-based level here in New Orleans. There needs to be more, and we need to do more community gardens and more community-based agriculture. But we're moving in the right direction.
This is me just speaking very freely from the conversations that I have many days. It brought up a couple of things about, community gardens, about, I also think about how like the whitewashing of what healthy means and what healthy food is. I was trying to text my friend who's a chef. I was trying to see if I could get her to respond to me while this is on, but she had shared, there's a book that talks about some like foods that like Southern foods that are often known for not being healthy. And again, when we think about what healthy food is or isn't, it is again, very, very whitewashed, and it's very, very strict confines. And I wish I could remember the name of the book, but it's a wonderful book that's talking about, the cooking gene. Yay, someone brought it up. about like various foods that are like either traditional or historical to a sense in some communities. So I'm thinking about that. I'm also thinking about how some countries in some European countries have instituted policies that like you can't get rid of food just because it's ugly. You know, we have this whole thing in the US where everything has to be perfectly round and not squishy and like very weird things that, yeah, that people like don't know what food actually looks like. So I'm thinking about, you know, policy changes in that aspect. There's a wonderful app that I think is only in some larger cities right now. It's called Too Good to Go. Companies or restaurants and food places that sell food sign up for it, that you can get like discounted food as like you go into the app to like kind of reserve. So you get something like so much cheaper. Also, if you're a Columbia student, it's great because there's a lot of cheaper stuff around the university. It's called Too Good to Go. And then I'm also thinking about how recently I just saw that some of these like community garden, like those boxes that people can send with fresh produce, now you can pay for it with your SNAP card, which I think is really, really important because they're pretty expensive for like a lot of produce, and it's not a lot of quick things that you can just like cook and have like a whole meal that fills you up. Yeah, it may be more nutritious, but I think we also have to think about how you're trying to think of like how to not be hungry and not like demonize that. So I think, again, everything I'm going to say is it depends and it's multifaceted, and thinking about, you know, policies about food waste, and then some social work advocacy people should try to find some ways of going against agricultural lobbies because they're very, very strong. Like we don't think about how strong they are. And then just thinking about more local food sources. So again, this gets me really excited.
Piggyback again. You know, I consider myself an observer. And a lot of times what I've observed, and you know, food comes down to economics, and healthy food comes down to economics. And I call it the supermarket hierarchy. So if you have money, you start at Whole Foods. Let's talk specifically here in New Orleans. That's the healthiest place to get healthy food, the best produce, whatever. But it is super, super expensive. Then we drop down to a restaurant chain called Rouse's, which is just a step below Whole Foods. It's a little less costly. The quality of food is decent. From there, we go to what's called Winn-Dixie, which is another step down. So it's the cost is cheaper, but the food health-wise is salt laden and preservative, all of those things. And then we drop all the way down to Walmart, which is you can get the biggest bang for your buck, but you're not really getting anything that's healthy. So it truly boils down to, for me, and on this issue is economics, and you know, making good food, healthy food, affordable, and not being penalized because you're in an income bracket and you're forced to, because of racist policy and all those other things, you are forced to only have limited options for healthy food.
Okay, there's one more question in the Q&A, and it's for Todd, and it says, can you talk a little about the Green Team and how training youth with green infrastructure skills can counteract economic inequities?
Hi, Rebecca. Oh, absolutely. So it's more than our Green Team. We have two programs. We have a Green Team and we have a ground crew. The Green Team are I call them my babies. Those are my high school students. They come and intern with us after school 2 or 3 days a week for a couple hours and about 4 hours on Saturday. They are paid. It is a paid internship. The Green Team starts at $10 an hour. It's you know, some money in their pockets. They have opportunities as they stay with us over the years. They get leadership opportunities, and their earning potential goes up. But it is based on creating environmental stewards, environmental education, small scale green infrastructure projects, A lot of community engagement projects where they're out in the community knocking on doors. We do something called Plant for Peace every year, where we plant about 200-300 trees, and our students go out and into the general public and knock on doors. Hey, would you like a tree here? This is the advantages of having a tree. So they do a lot of that community engagement work. Those who don't go off to college or want to continue in green infrastructure, they come to my ground crew program, which I call my heavy hitters. So we do large scale municipal green infrastructure projects. And we start at $15 an hour. I have ground crew that have been with me for several years. They're up to $20 an hour now. So we are committed to trying to close that income gap, certify young folks in green infrastructure, but then actually have them do green infrastructure projects in their communities that are leaving a community asset that they can be proud of. They're being paid as professionals. So we have continued to build on that model. We don't have why I say it's kind of it's a different paradigm. We don't have a graduation. You can stay with me as long as you like. If you want to continue in this field, then it's incumbent on me to make sure that as an organization, we continue to have projects in green infrastructure and other avenues. We have a team right now working in Atlanta doing green infrastructure and historic renovation on MLK National Park. One of the houses is the house that Dr. King grew up in. We're doing some green infrastructure add-ons to that. So it's just keeping multiple options open for young people at a sustainable wage, not $7 an hour, not $8 an hour, starting at 15, getting up to 20, 22 hours an hour, and keeping them gainfully employed with the caveat that when you're ready, if you choose to leave, we will help you through that process, but don't leave for anything less than what we're doing here now. So I think that's how we're helping with economically helping our young folks, both Green Team and Ground Crew, become stable and sustainable.
Yeah, thank you so much, Todd. That sounds like an incredible opportunity and program for youth. So we have one question that just came in. And it says, are there organizations in New York City that you recommend for students to be involved in green infrastructure?
Can I help? So Groundwork is a network of trusts. There are 21, we call them trusts, Groundwork trusts around the country. Groundwork USA, corporate office, for lack of a better word, is in Yonkers. There is a Groundwork Hudson Valley, which is in Hudson Valley, New York. I'm not sure geographically how close that is to the city, but that may be the closest Groundwork, and that's specifically they're working on environmental issues with young people, green infrastructure, environmental sustainability, all those in that New York metropolitan. There's several there's one in Boston, there's one in Lawrence, there was one in Virginia. I think the headquarters is in Yonkers, and there's one in Hudson Valley. But if New York is interested in starting a Groundwork, I can always point you in the right direction.
So to wrap up, I just wanted to thank both of you for coming and talking to us. I feel like we all learned so much from you, and it's like such a long time coming for this panel. So we're so grateful.
Thank you for having me. Let's stay in touch.